Well, I woke up to a little bit of sad news this morning. It appears that Nikon is no longer making these. So some of you may have received the email with the rumor that the Nikon D850 is discontinued.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
As it turns out, thankfully for us, this is just a rumor. Doing a little bit of research myself, come to find out, B&H Photo sent an email to all of their customers that were on the wait list for the D850 saying that the D850 was now discontinued. Well, from everything I can read online, it sounds like this was a mistake on the part of B&H Photo. There's some sort of system that they have that notifies people of products that are out of stock, and occasionally it will say that the product is discontinued when it's just been out of stock for a really long time and they don't imagine they're going to be able to get any out to their customers anytime soon. So there's no indication from Nikon yet that the Nikon D850 has been discontinued, even though the camera is getting about to that age where they might discontinue the D850 and we might see a replacement coming out sometime in the next 6 months or year. So keep your eyes peeled for that. My honest hope is that they do replace the Nikon D850, but I hope they replace it with a very similar camera body DSLR camera. I know that Nikon now has the Z6 and the Z7. I don't really have any experience with the Z6 or the Z7, but there are a lot of things I like about this D850 that compared to a Z6 or a Z7 have kept me from switching or upgraded. Not necessarily because I think this is a better camera than the Z6 or the Z7, but they're just things that I prefer and I've come to really like in the D850. And for lack of, I guess, a better term, I've been slow to adapt to the mirrorless camera system. So I do actually have a Sony A7sii, which I'm using to film this video. And I think that mirrorless cameras are the future of professional, semi-professional, whatever you want to call this market of digital cameras. But I think the D850 has its place, and I think it's won its place in the market. And since we're in this awkward situation with these rumors going around about the Nikon D850, I figured this is actually a good time for me to do a little bit of a review on my D850, which I've had for a long time now, 4 or 5 years. And whether you should buy it now in 2021, is it still a relevant camera, all that kind of stuff. So is the Nikon D850 still relevant in 2021? Well, that is a great question. I would say yes, but I'm biased because this has been my go-to camera for a long time. This is something that I tell all of my personal friends when they ask me about buying a camera body. They always ask me questions as if the camera body will somehow change how good their photos are, which in some cases may be true, but for the most part, 99.9% of people will not be able to tell the difference between a photo taken on a Canon T6i and a Nikon D850, so long as you're using the same lens, aperture, all those sorts of things, right? So the real question comes down to, what are you going to use it for? Are you a videographer? Are you a wildlife photographer? Are you an astrophotographer? Are you a landscape photographer? Whatever it is that you might be doing with that camera should be the reason why you're purchasing that camera. Now, there's going to be a lot of you who are in multiple boats here, right? You wear multiple shoes, you wear multiple hats, you use the camera for multiple things. I'm one of those people, so I photograph landscapes primarily. I photograph astrophotography. I do a little bit of wildlife here and there on the side. I do portraits, I do real estate, I do products, I do vehicles. I'm kind of all over the map. I photograph a lot of different things, even though landscapes and astrophotography are kind of that's really my primary focus. And so for me, the Nikon D850 makes a lot of sense for a few reasons. The high resolution of the Nikon D850 allows me to print my images really large, and it allows me to crop my images significantly when I'm doing something like wildlife. It's also really nice to have that high megapixel count so that I can get lots and lots of detail in certain images if I need to do a big panorama and print it, whether I need to take a picture of a product and end up putting it on a billboard. I have a lot of control there. One of the drawbacks of using such a high megapixel count camera is you actually lose just a little bit of dynamic range, generally speaking, when you have a higher megapixel count. This comes down to the fact that the pixels have to be smaller. So if you have the same sensor size and you have a 12 megapixel sensor, right, each one of those pixels will be slightly larger in size, allowing them to absorb a little bit more color and light information in post that you can mess with. With the Nikon D850, each of those pixels, because there's so many of them on the sensor, have to be a little bit smaller in order to fit them all in that same size sensor, meaning that each of them records slightly less information per pixel. I haven't really noticed this as a huge problem. There's definitely a high dynamic range difference between the D850 and cameras like the Sony A7S2. Obviously, cameras with a lower megapixel count, generally speaking, have better dynamic range. And so if you are one of those people that doesn't like to stack or bracket or do HDR, and you're not really printing very big and you don't need very large files, this probably isn't the camera for you. I would say go with something like the Sony A7S2 or any of these low megapixel count sensors. Another instance where this might not be the camera for you is if you are primarily doing video. If 99% of your work is video and you're doing a few photos here on the side but you're not printing them very big, I wouldn't necessarily say the Nikon D850 is a bad option, but it's not going to be the right option for you. I would go with the Sony A7S III, the Sony A7S2. Those cameras are kind of geared towards that market of photographer, videographer. So I would say do a little bit of research, maybe look into the Sony, maybe look into Canon. There's other options from Nikon, but I don't think the Nikon D850 is really meant to be a video camera. So I actually ended up picking up a Sony A7S II about 6 months ago, which is what I'm using to film this with. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like having the Sony A7S II after using the D850 for so long and kind of compare those two cameras. So taking them head to head, I have to say, as odd as it is, if I could only have one of these two cameras, if I could only have the Sony A7S II or the D850, hands down, period, and I would have the D850. No debate. There's no debate. I would pick the D850 over the Sony A7S II any day of the week. Why would I say that? Especially considering that most of my work is astrophotography. If you've read my articles, I recommend the Sony A7S II as one of the best astrophotography cameras. And that's still true. I still believe that. The reason why is because I think the D850 is a more rounded camera. I think it's a more rounded platform. I think it's better at doing a wider range of things. And for me, I have adapted my work to revolve around taking multiple exposures for every image to stack or to blend or to track or to do whatever I have to increase the quality of my image, whether that's a bracketed HDR shot for real estate, whether that's a landscape where I need to focus stack, whether that's an astrophotography image where I expose my foreground as an 8-minute exposure and then I turn my star tracker on and I expose my sky, whatever it is, I have adapted my work to revolve around the highest quality I can possibly achieve, and this is the tool for that. This is an excellent tool for that. Now, granted, if you are an action sports photographer or a traveling photographer or a portrait photographer, that may not be an option for you. Or if you're a videographer, for example, the Sony is a better camera, hands down, for video, for portraits for the most part, and for anything in low light and for just high dynamic range images. The Sony takes the cake, hands down, period, end. But for me, for my situation, I still prefer the D850, and I think the D850 is the best tool for me for the range of things that I'm doing. The Sony that I picked up, the 7S II, has really ended up just being my video camera, which is what I'm using it for now. I've really kind of grown to dislike the electronic viewfinder and the screen of the Sony A7S II. So to be totally blunt with you guys and to be totally honest, moving from the D850 to the Sony A7S II was, well, disappointing. I have grown so used to the high resolution of the screen itself on the Nikon D850 where When I'm doing wildlife, when I'm doing real estate, when I'm doing a product, when I'm photographing a landscape, I can take an image and I can zoom in and I can tell if I'm in focus. I can tell what with every single rock and leaf and everything in that image is in focus so easily. And when I'm focusing with my live view screen, I can zoom in and I can focus without a problem on this. I've never had a problem with that. It's never been an issue for me because the built-in screen on the Nikon D850 is so good that I can do everything I need to, regardless of how bright it is outside. I can get a little bit of shade. I can see past the glare. One of my biggest pet peeves with the Sony A7S2 is the resolution and the quality of the actual display screen built into the camera and the display on the inside of the electronic viewfinder is so bad that I have a hard time telling whether or not I'm in focus or not. So I actually have to keep focus peaking on 99% of the time on my A7S2 in order to ever even be able to tell. The other thing that is kind of annoying about the Sony A7S2 is the resolution is so low that when you go to zoom in on your focus magnifier, you're actually losing enough resolution that the resolution is making the image appear soft. And so every time I try and find absolute focus on the Sony A7S2, I encounter this issue where I sit there for 15 or 20 minutes just trying to figure out whether or not I'm in focus or not because of the quality of the screen. And so that has really become a drawback for me on the Sony A7S2 is the screen quality and the being able to tell whether or not your shot is in focus or not in focus or what it actually looks like in the field is incredibly important to me. And so as a photography camera, that is my biggest pet peeve with the Sony A7S2. It's actually a big enough pet peeve of mine that I probably would not buy the Sony A7S2 again. I would buy it for video, but I would not buy it for photography again unless I was planning on just doing single exposures. Now, I must say the video quality on the Sony A7S2 and the video capabilities on the Sony A7S2 is better. That's how it is. Hands down, the Sony is a better video camera. One of the things most people do when they get serious about video is they go and get an external screen like the Atomos and they mount it to the back of their camera so they can actually, there's a wide range of reasons why you would do that. So if that's what you plan on doing, I would highly recommend doing it with the Sony A7S2 so you can have a better display screen, actually kind of see what's going on. Then by all means, in that case, it doesn't really matter for you. If you're a photographer, however, I just got to say that the display on the Sony A7S2 compared to the display on the Nikon D850 will definitely disappoint you. On the Sony, the screen flips down and does all the same things the Nikon D850 does. It doesn't flip to the side like the Canon cameras do. I really wish that they would do that where it could flip and face you so you could actually see yourself when you're filming or doing something like that. But both the Sony A7S2 and the D850, they flip out, they flip up, they flip down, which is really convenient when you need to set the camera down low and you can look down at your screen, or if it's up high. There are a lot of instances where I use this, and I think that that was one of the smartest things Nikon did. One of the things that also is really nice about the D850 is it has a touch screen, which is great for autofocus. I can actually adjust things on my menu and my display. The screen is a full service touch screen on this, which it's not on the Sony A7S II. Granted, this camera is slightly newer than the Sony A7S II, and I have not used the Sony A7S III or had any experience with the Sony A7S III yet at all. But the Sony A7S II is a dedicated screen that is not a touch screen, and getting used to the menu options is a little bit different on Sony for those of you who have messed with Sony before. I really like just the general dexterity of the D850. It's very fast for me to adjust my shutter, my aperture, my ISO. It takes me seconds. Granted, I've had this camera for years, and I have not had the Sony for that long, but the positioning of the buttons on the Sony seems a little bit funny to me. The video record button on the Sony is located over here, which is kind of an awkward thing to do, to have to take your thumb off the back of the camera to move it to that position, where on the Nikon, it's actually up here. And so it's really quick for me to be able to go from taking a photo to boom, video mode, and start recording. Just generally speaking, I think the layout of the D850 was thought through a little bit better. And Not to say that I think the Sony is uncomfortable. I love how light it is, and I actually think it's very comfortable in your hand to hold, but it is just small enough that I still prefer having the full-size DSLR grip. I feel like it's a lot easier for me to control this and move it around, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you're doing portraits, when you're doing wildlife, that kind of thing becomes pretty important pretty quickly. So I wouldn't say that's really going to make or break one camera over the other, but I definitely would consider the general dexterity and access and layout of the D850 to be better significantly than the Sony is. So a couple things that I don't like about the D850. Like I mentioned, a lot of these will be kind of nitpicky things that I've kind of just come to not like. One of the things, so the built-in microphone. Never good on any camera. I don't really know of any camera that has a good built-in microphone. It's actually pretty good on this. I've been surprised. I've done actually a few videos, and you'll probably see some of that on this channel, where I'm holding the camera like this. And surprisingly, the audio is usable when I'm inside my car and it's not windy. But any other environment, yeah, built-in microphone is not great. Don't use a built-in microphone ever. So that's one thing. Another nitpicky thing about the D850 that has kind of come to annoy me is batteries. So batteries for the Nikon D850 are excellent as long as they're made by Nikon. So on my D810, I actually probably had 12 batteries for that camera, and most of them were purchased from a third party for like 20 bucks a battery. I mean, they were just knockoff gray market brand, you know, whatever, Wasabi Power or something. And they worked great. I never had a problem. They lasted a long time. They worked really well. Everything about them was great. They were cheap. Those don't work in the D850. It has something to do with the chip that they put in their batteries, so that the Nikon D850 will intentionally reject non-Nikon official batteries. And so I have had to go out and purchase a bunch of $70 batteries, which is stupid. But Nikon has to make their money somehow, so that's the sneaky way that they steal your money, is by making really expensive camera batteries and forcing you to use only their batteries. So that being said, I have 5 batteries for this. I don't really ever need all 5 of those batteries unless I'm backpacking for multiple days, and so the battery life is absolutely incredible. The cost of the batteries themselves is really annoying. Getting into other little tiny nitpicky things I don't like about the D850. I love the tilting screen. I love the touch screen. I love how easy it is to use. Why can't we just get the folding screen that the Canon T6i, the Canon T7i, I know it can break, but those cameras, those screens, they flip out to the side, they fold around so that if you're filming yourself, you can actually see on the screen. It seems kind of like an unnecessary feature, but it's extremely useful. And so I love this tilting, folding screen. I use it every single day. But would have been nice if we had that folding screen. So if you're watching this, Nikon, and you're working on a replacement D850, just take that one into consideration, please. That would be really nice. The next thing that is also really nitpicky, I really, really, really like how Sony allows you to charge your camera batteries while they're in the camera, or power the camera entirely by a USB cord on the side of the camera, which is how the Sony I'm running right now is being powered. So Sony's set up on a tripod right now, and I actually just have a power cord, just a USB cord plugged into the side of the Sony, running down to a extension cord there on the floor, which runs over here to an outlet. So I can actually power my Sony from a power bank. I can power it from the USB port in my car. I can power it from a wall outlet. That would have been awesome on this camera. Yes, the battery life on this is so good that it almost doesn't matter, but I really would have liked to have that option on this camera or on any Nikon camera. So if there's a replacement coming for the D850, I would really like to see that happen. I think that would be a huge improvement on these cameras. Moving forward, I'm honestly struggling to think of things that I don't like about this camera. Everything that I don't like about this camera is something that is kind of foolish, or you wouldn't buy this camera to begin with because of that situation. Like, I could complain about the dynamic range and how easy it is to get blurry photos because of the high megapixel count, and you need to have a really fast shutter speed to keep up with that. But those are all problems you should consider before buying this camera. Like, this is a high resolution camera. That's just what it is. And so I think the pros outweigh the cons to such an extent that it's actually hard for me to think of things that are valid to complain about on this camera. So why should you buy the Nikon D850? Well, I'm going to give you a list of specific environments in which the Nikon D850 excels. If you are an action sports photographer, this is the camera for you. If you are a wildlife photographer, this is the camera for you. If you are a landscape photographer that wants to print your images really big, this is the camera for you. I can't tell you enough how awesome this camera is in wildlife situations, in situations with action sports, in any kind of situation where you need to print something really large. This camera is incredible. Now, granted, you still need to understand how to use the camera. You need to be somewhat familiar with the printing process. You need to be technically oriented in order for this camera to do you any good at all. However, if you are one of those people who is already technically oriented, this will be one of the best cameras you can possibly buy for any one of those types of photography. There's a lot of different reasons why I still prefer this camera body over something like the Z6 or the Z7. Like I mentioned before, I really like having the optical viewfinder. When it comes to wildlife, I still prefer having the optical viewfinder. You can call me crazy, I know that's kind of weird, but this thing's autofocus and its capabilities when photographing wildlife are very hard to beat. I wouldn't say it's the best camera there is for wildlife photography, but I would say that it is extremely hard to beat, and it is one of the better options you can have for wildlife photography. One of the really handy features about the D850 is that you have two card slots. So you have a standard SD card slot, and then you have an XQD card slot. If you're not familiar with XQD, it's a really funny card system developed by Sony for Nikon. I don't know if there are any other cameras yet that use the XQD system, but I have a couple of these XQD cards. They are extremely expensive. However, they do have extremely fast read and write speed. So this one that I have here, I believe is a 400. I have a 440 read speed and a 400 write speed, megabits per second. So incredibly fast, which is really awesome when you have such large files and you're shooting in bursts. You do need the battery grip. I can't remember what the standard is. I think it's seven images per second or something standard, and you can upgrade that to 9 if you have the Nikon battery grip for this. I've never needed that many images. I've been able to get enough images in burst mode standard without the battery grip so far. But being able to shoot in burst mode like that and record to read and write fast enough to your card in such a high resolution is a really nice feature of the D850. I have no idea if the Z6 or the Z7 take XQD cards, to be honest. But another nitpicky problem of mine is I still like the feel of a big, girthy, DSLR camera. I still prefer that. It feels better in my hand. It's easier for me to move around and control. And I know it's heavier, I know it's bigger, I know that the mirror has problems, but I am just still in love with this camera, and I still like having a DSLR camera. And so, having those features, having that ability to shoot wildlife that fast in burst mode, read and write, I actually use those XQD cards 99% of the time for time lapse. So when I'm shooting a time lapse, I know that I can record images quickly, and I can actually see on the back of my camera there's a little light here that turns on green as soon as it writes the image to the card, and so I can see that the camera, without having to touch it, is continuously exposing, taking photos, and time-lapsing for me. And I don't have to worry about it not recording those images or the card not being capable of keeping up. I just know that I'm scotch-free. It's recording those 45 megapixel images back to back to back every second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds or whatever the interval is. I'm not worried about it not being able to keep up because it's such a workhorse of a camera that it does it so smoothly. Like I mentioned before, there will be some links in the description of this video that will take you to Amazon where you can purchase a Nikon D850. I'm going to try and keep those updated as best I can to only be links that take you to places where they are in stock, but I might miss. Who knows? These things are probably going to be selling like wildfire now that we have the combination of a price cut and these rumors circulating about them being discontinued. So you might have a hard time finding one of these, but if you get the opportunity and you can afford it and you've been considering this camera, I simply cannot recommend this camera enough, and I don't think you would ever be disappointed with this camera. I think there's a lot of different other camera options you could purchase that you might not necessarily regret, but you might be a little bit disappointed, and I have never been disappointed by this camera. There are very few things about this camera that I dislike, and every single one of them is, you know, picky or negligible or silly, to say the least. So I really, 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 really recommend this camera. That being said, if you really want this camera body and you're sold on this camera body, I'm actually thinking about buying a second one myself, as crazy as that sounds. The main intention behind that would be to continue to use this one and just keep that brand new one in the box. And then when this one gets killed from all of the continuous abuse that I'm going to put on it and have put on it for the past 4 years, then I'll just unbox that one, because I love this camera so much that I really, really, really do not want Nikon to replace it with something drastically different. I really want to see Nikon come forward with something similar to this, with just a few improvements in the technology of the camera and a few improvements, a few upgrades to the overall design and functionality and features. But other than that, I love this camera so much that I really, really do want to see something similar come forward. And I hope that if they do discontinue it, that that's what we end up getting, is something that's really similar to the D850. Now, there are a lot of photographers, really well-known ones who I'm not going to mention here, who have expressed their concerns with this camera. They've had issues with this camera. I've heard a lot of those issues. I've seen a lot of those complaints. I have never had those problems myself. There are a lot of complaints about the dynamic range of the camera because of the high megapixel count, which is understandable. Nikon released the D780 not long ago, and I think the Nikon D780 is an excellent compromise in resolution, which will probably give you the dynamic range that most people kind of expect and want out of their DSLR camera. And so the Nikon D870 might be a better option for you depending on what kind of photography you're doing, and it is a more recent release than the Nikon D850. So honestly, if we could just see kind of a hybrid of those two cameras, the D780 and the Nikon D850, I would be really impressed with that coming from Nikon. Or really honestly just a new and improved Nikon D850. To be totally honest, I don't really understand how Nikon's little numbering system from D810 to D850, I don't know what the next one is, supposed to be numbered or whatever, but if they could just give us a Nikon D850 round 2 with some improved software and some improved sensor technology and a couple other features, I think I would be perfectly happy with that. So overall, personal favorite camera body, I would still pick this if I had to choose between this or really any other camera body. I am so in love with this camera body that I don't really think I would pick anything else. I would really love to test out the Sony A7S3. I would love to do some playing around with the R6, with the Z6 and the Z7. I've heard great things about those cameras, but still, I would end up picking my old reliable Nikon D850 over any of those camera bodies, because I know it and I trust it, and I think it's a great camera. I think it's well-rounded. I think it was an excellent move by Nikon at the time when it came out, despite the few things that I think might be a setback for some people. I think this is a well-rounded enough camera that I really think it would be hard to be disappointed with this camera. So that pretty much concludes this video. Hopefully this was helpful to some of you. Hopefully this will help you decide whether or not to buy this camera or another camera like the Sony A7S II. Feel free to comment your questions, maybe send me a DM on Instagram. Like and subscribe the video. That will make sure that you see future releases. I'm going to be doing a lot more content about the camera bodies that I use and the lenses that I use, and some just kind of useful reviews and tips and tricks. And that's what you can expect to see a lot more of. So thank you again for watching. We will see you guys in the field.